How many of you find yourself getting frustrated and angry over the current situation in our country?
Oh.
Okay, all right.
That means yes.
So, join the club. Everybody in our culture is feeling frustrated and angry. And I want to share something. I want to share a frustrated and angry Jesus this morning. Now, the Buddhists have a hard time with this account in Matthew and in the Gospels where Jesus comes into Jerusalem, goes into the temple, and starts to overturn tables of money changers and shoos everybody out. Because, you know, in Buddhism, one of the great problems is anger because it gets in the way of meditation. That's the problem.
Yep.
It's not necessarily being angry with somebody. It's the problem that it screws up your meditation. So even though Buddhists have a great reverence for Jesus as an enlightened being, this is problematic for them. I'll tell you what, I'm glad that I can look at the historical Jesus and see that he was upset about some stuff happening as a human being. And here's an example where Jesus was upset and he did something about it. So I've entitled this, Jesus Gets Political. And politically, he gets motivated by what was going on, and he's angry about what's going on, and so I want to unpack that. But I want to tie it into what's going on in our culture, because I think that's helpful to make a link. Danny's right. We need to be thinking as followers of Jesus. Now, so bear with me. Listen closely. I don't ask that you agree. I do ask that you listen closely to what I'm going to share to get us thinking about this. Both political parties and much of the news and social media are guilty today of something the Nazis did. The Nazis saturated public life with extremist propaganda about their opponents,
Yep.
while at the same time promoting themselves as the saviors to the very hostile conditions they created.
Yep.
It's like a firefighter starting a fire, blaming someone else, and taking credit for when it's put out. Of course, the problem is our politicians and the media are not solving any of our problems. They're making them worse. They're making them worse. Most Germans fell under the spell of Nazi propaganda. How sad. Germany, remember, was the most advanced nation in the world at the time, technologically and scientifically. It was a Christian nation, mostly Lutherans. The Nazis and German people were not mentally ill. Yet many fell under Hitler's gospel of hate and Aryan supremacy. Nazis executed 15 million innocent men, women, and children, 6 million of whom their only guilt was happening to be Jewish. The war Hitler and the Nazis started cost 60 million lives. Now, may I make another comparison with our current political environment? The Nazis also trivialized and suppressed the church in Germany. Traditional faith was mocked, while the Nazis demanded complete devotion to the Führer and his Third Reich. Nazism became essentially the new religion of Germany, and Hitler the new God.
Yep.
Again, their gospel of Aryan superiority, which required marginalizing others perceived to be inferior, and resulted in outright hatred for whole other races, especially the Jews,
Yep.
Gypsies, others. You could be imprisoned and even executed for disagreeing with this gospel. Now, by the way, as a footnote here, unlike the media and some politicians, I'm not calling anyone a Nazi in our current political situation. I think that would be improper historically, and actually an insult to those who were executed under Nazism. But I'm making some frightening comparisons. And the church needs to be awake. And I want you to let me know if I've gone too far this morning. And please let me know. 22 innocent, unarmed people were murdered by a young man seemingly caught up in this environment of otherizing people by race, marginalizing them, making them a scapegoat for the things that he hated. Now, regardless of your political position on immigration, violence is not the solution, let alone murder. But you got caught up into that. Reminiscent of what was going on in Nazi Germany. What was the response to the horrible act of hatred by some? I mean, how do you deal with something like that in our nation? Well, some showed up at the house of Senator Mitch McConnell and called for him to be stabbed in the heart. I don't think that's going to solve the problem.
Nope.
Leading politicians use this sad event to bolster their own political standing. I don't think that's going to solve the problem. In fact, I find that despicable. Have we no one to call Americans together for peace, understanding, and reconciliation? Are you telling me it's gotten that bad? No one? Where's Martin Luther King when we need him? Where's the church leaders to stand up and say enough and call our nation together for peace and reconciliation? Are we going to continue to be mesmerized like the Germans by hatred, by political affiliation? Who will call us together? Oh, that's that Christian BS. Love your neighbor. Become peacemakers. Calling all people to be reconciled in Christ. Really? Are we to be embarrassed? Are we really going to allow ourselves to be driven into silence because we don't want to offend anybody with the Christian message of the gospel of peace? Like the German church was? I'm now convinced that suppressing religious expression in our culture, including schools and especially in homes, has opened the door for this type of pernicious division and hatred now spreading across our nation.
Yep.
Now, I'm not talking about imposing religion or God on anyone. I'm talking about the fact that imposing banal political ideology on everyone by secular politicians and media juggernauts is ruining our nation.
Amen.
And everybody is standing by. What voices saturate our culture? Those we cannot avoid hearing because we hear them everywhere. Voices that suggest only a political solution from either political party. Are there no other answers? Listen, I don't care if they throw the name of God or mix the name of God in to a Republican or Democratic position. We never hear a God solution.
Amen.
Yeah.
We're not hearing the gospel. So what is the solution to gun violence? How many more laws do we need if people will not obey the laws that are on the books?
Amen.
You cannot legislate the human heart. I don't care how many laws you pour. The murderer, the killer will find a way to kill.
Yep.
To tell you the truth, I think I'd rather be killed by a gun than a hammer any day anyway. The killer is going to find a way to kill. We got to get to people's hearts. Now, some of these people belong in mental hospitals. But most of these terrorists are not mentally ill. Studies have shown. There's a heart problem. There's a heart problem.
Amen.
More exhaustive background checks? Sure, I'm all for it. But we, you and I, must do our part to lead people to a better way. We need to voice up. We need to stand up. When someone gives his or her heart to God, they don't need a string of laws or a threat of punishment. Is that right?
Amen.
They have one great conviction: to love God, the Lord their God, with all their heart, mind, and strength, and to love their neighbor as themselves. How many problems would that solve, brothers and sisters? We don't want to bring religious morals back into our culture and schools. We're told we don't need to believe in God to be moral. I agree. But it sure helps some people.
Yep.
It sure helps some people. How about thou shalt not murder? The Nazis conveniently replaced faith in God for the gospel of the Third Reich. And many German churches capitulated. My friend and mentor, Dr. Robert Fife, now with the Lord, a wonderful Christian man, served in the Appalachian Mountains to poor people, became a wide-known scholar, and what a Christian gentleman he was.
Amen. Amen.
He was a chaplain in the Second World War, and they were freeing Dachau.
Yeah.
And as the troops were coming in, freeing the Jewish people that had been and by the way, they were murdering as many Jews as they could when the Allies were showing up. They were burning them in ovens. And he says, as the troops marched towards the camp, ashes, human ashes, were raining down on them and on a church they marched by, and the German church people were inside singing praises to God, while across the way they were executing and incinerating Jewish people. That's what happens when the church doesn't speak up.
Amen.
And the church in Germany was guilty for not speaking up against the Nazis.
Amen.
Well, wait a minute, not everybody. Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke up, a German pastor. And what happened to him? They threw his ass in jail and they executed him. But he could not remain silent against this Nazi hatred. Well, the church remained silent in our age. This all reminds me of what Jesus did near the end of his life. The Gospels all tell us that Jesus was making his way towards Jerusalem. By that way, some Christians call themselves the Way. So he's making his way towards Jerusalem, the Gospels tell us, as he ministered. And by the way, Jesus was warned by friend and foe. Even his enemies said, hey, better not go to Jerusalem, man. They're going to kill you. The historian John Dominic Crossan said that Jesus would have had to know, if he went into Jerusalem and went to the temple, it was a death sentence.
Yeah.
Especially during the Passover, because Pilate had flooded the city with Roman soldiers. And what does Jesus do? He not only goes to Jerusalem, he goes right into the temple. And not undercover. He goes into the temple, he sees them exchanging money. In other words, ripping off poor people that have come to worship God. And he overturns the table, and he chases them out of the temple. Because they had replaced God with a monetary system and political advantage. Now understand something. The Jewish temple was controlled by the Sadducees, the Jewish priests. Most Jews thought they were corrupt. The temple, like all ancient temples, was also a political institution. Not just a religious institution.
Amen.
They made a lot of money. These priests were fantastically wealthy. The Sadducees were also working with the Romans. Again, it was political. The Sadducees had their own army. It was a big army. They were filthy rich. And so the priests had replaced traditional devotion to God and worship with their political agendas and their opportunities to rip off people and become wealthy, increase their power, and again, it took advantage of most poor Jewish people. Instead of carrying out God's will, helping his people, they became the handmaids of Rome. Notice Jesus acts against the corruption of the temple, essentially restoring God back to the temple, to his proper place. He acted out, man. Now tell me that didn't take some courage.
Amen.
In fact, they arrested Jesus later and crucified him. But he had to speak up. So he's restoring God back to the temple. And notice in that same passage, after he kicks these corrupt people out, what does he do? The text says, in the temple, he was healing and comforting people. In other words, restoring God back to its place. The church needs to restore God back to our culture. Our role of the church in our culture is not to overthrow a secular government and replace it with a theocracy like ancient Israel. Our job requires that we do not stand by idly like the church in Germany when Germans needed to hear the voice of God. They needed to hear a better way. They needed to hear the way of Jesus. We are the voice of God, calling people to a better way, the way of the gospel, the way of Jesus, the way of peace, love, and reconciliation. The politics of our culture is ruining our nation.
Amen.
We have the answer.
Amen.